Dot, 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 dot. Good morning, everybody. This is Grant from State of the Spark. And if you don't know, I am super pumped for today's show, mainly because we're going to be talking about how to prepare for crisis thinking. And more important than that, it's not just about being prepared for all the crises that the world is throwing at you that they want you to think about. The goal is to break from crisis thinking so that you too can be a resource for those around you. I'm looking forward to that. Before that, we're going to be talking about other news, uplifting news to make you a smarter global citizen. And we're going to be talking about a young man, Tom DeFreston, whose 10 years of art was burned and how that is being utilized. But before any of that, you know what time it is. It's time for a morning cup of gratitude. If you haven't had a second yet, go grab some coffee so that we can sit together and chat together and talk a little bit more about being prepared for crisis thinking today, especially. And they're moving you from one crisis to another. If you haven't seen that yet, then I guess good for you. But most of us have actually seen that they're just trying to get us to move from one state of crisis thinking to the next. And it's really difficult to not. And I want to prepare you with that. But what am I grateful for? What are you grateful for this morning? I want to hear in the comments below the things that you are absolutely most grateful for this morning. And I got one to share. I'm absolutely grateful. Gratitude, my dude, Billy Weigel. For those who don't know, I was able to interview Billy and hear just his heart and his background a little bit. And I do want to spend more time with this guy. He's just got a powerful framework for the world. And we got his interview, which I'm going to be releasing on Friday. So that's coming. Billy, I hope you're doing so good this morning, man. So we're going to be covering all of that and more. But what are you grateful for before we get started? What's got you pumped? This is the thing I'm grateful for this weekend. And it's actually something that was challenging. You know, I've been doing the show a while now, and we've been getting sponsors, and we've been getting more and more interviews, and people have been sharing, and a lot of the message of Spark Nation is kind of getting out, and we're codifying that a little bit more, and just getting a lot more exposure. And I haven't mentally prepared for this like I should. Someone walked up to me just this weekend and said, "Are you Grant?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And she said, "I watch all your stuff." And I was caught by this because it's so rare. It's happened only a few times that someone's like, "I saw your show," or "I listened to your stuff," or "I listened to your podcast," or they're in touch with the message somehow. And I wasn't ready for this. I was talking to a friend, and I was kind of caught back. And I need to be better mentally prepared because these people are the backbone of the people A, I'm reaching, B, of how the message of what's going on with State of the Spark gets out. And I made a joke, and it was so embarrassing. You can be embarrassed with me. I turned to the gentleman I was talking to, Tim Rice, a local pastor, and I said, "Well, Tim," because I was shaking her hand, and I felt suddenly off guard, like I just wasn't mentally prepared to be grateful to this person. But I was shaking her hand, and I turned to Tim Rice, and I said, "I'm kind of internet famous," just kind of being schmaltzy a little bit, and I felt awkward. And I didn't know what else to say. And he laughed and he kind of walked away. And then I went to turn and actually engage with this person, and I didn't catch them soon enough. But what I'm grateful for is that there's people out there that have grace for me to kind of warm up to some of the exposure I'm getting to more and more people. So I'm grateful for her. I'm grateful for her watching the show. I'm grateful for Tim Rice kind of knowing that I was caught off guard a little bit, but I'm grateful for these moments with the people I am trying to reach. Too often, I am only surrounded with the echo chamber of those closest to you, your friends, your family, your loved ones. But I am grateful that the message of Spark and State of the Spark is getting out there to more and more people. That's what I'm grateful for this morning. What are you grateful for? Enough about me. What are you starting this week full of gratitude about? Tell me in the comments below so I can celebrate with you, so I can know more about who you are and what you're doing. Let's talk about other news. In other news, Ash Art Wednesday and Thursday, and every day for a solid 12 years. You see, hundreds of works of art by Tom DeFreston went completely burned. A little backstory here. Tom DeFreston is an artist who had worked up until that point for about 4 years with a Syrian gentleman by the name of Ali Suleiman. Now, Ali Suleiman was an artist in Syria, if I'm not mistaken. Joe Child said, "Beautiful morning today on Sanibel Island." Dude, Joe Childs, like literally, I thought I just saw a post from you driving to Ohio. This guy travels, he gets around, he's living the life. That's what he's grateful for this morning. I love it. So Tom DeFreston had worked with Syrian artist Ali Suleiman for about 4 years. Now, Ali Suleiman is a rather special Syrian artist in that he was an artist but had lost his eyesight in a lot of the war, and he is a refugee from Syria. He was working with Tom DeFreston for about 4 years and a documentarian as they went through the process of artist Tom DeFreston being the eyes and hands for the work of Ali Suleiman. And they would work through this process where Ali would describe his experiences and Tom would turn this into artwork. And now, as you can imagine, most of his artwork was full of rubble landscapes, full of pain and violence and dark tones. And this had been a consuming work for about 4 years. Well, one evening, as they were getting ready for their first gallery show, they had completed the series and they had all the video work and they were ready to go to the gallery the next day. And that evening, Tom DeFreston, who was known as an obsessive compulsive artist, sat down and realized he wanted to put just a little more char on one of the pieces. And he opened up his blowtorch and then he got a twitch in his eye and he closed his eye and it messed with his eye and he moved the blowtorch. And as you can imagine, all of that art went up in flames. He tried to put it out through a dramatic effort, and the fire brigade eventually showed up, but it took them 4 hours to put the work out, put the fire of the studio out. Now, as you can imagine, this was traumatizing to everyone involved. This was a crisis moment, and we're talking about crisis today, but we're talking about it, as you can imagine, without frowns, but we're talking about it in a way that you can handle it. Tom DeFreston exhibited a major trait of being able to take crisis and make it work for you. He woke up the next day and he was heartbroken as the Syrian artist Ali Suleiman had to show up, and blind, they had to guide his hand over all the artwork, which was now crumbling. The canvas was charred ash crumbling under his hands. But as they walked to the studio, they had a different experience than one might think. In this studio was also 10 years of artwork that Tom had done for another piece, 4 years of artwork that he'd done for the Syrian refugees, and it was all ash. And they began discussing, this is more accurate than the art we had been creating. And they sat and discussed the future of the artwork and what should be done. And it soon became obvious our artwork is not that of violence and despair. Our artwork is that which comes out of the ashes. And as you can imagine, since 2 years ago, for the last 2 years, artist Tom DeFreston, again with his friend Ali Suleiman and those around him, have been rebuilding, not recreating. They have not been trying to recreate their art in the least. Instead, they've been actually working on capturing anew the art of hopefulness, the art of landscapes. They have begun to do garden vistas and landscapes using the ash and rubble as material in the pieces. Tom DeFreston says that his art now has hopefulness, has grand galactic landscapes and skyscapes. Basically, the violence of the imagery has given way to a lighter, brighter attention to beauty. How someone had turned crisis, boom, I'm going to give you this link real quick because it's beautiful. Had someone had turned crisis into the very material of art that they had meant to use from the get-go. You got the link right there, and I really encourage you to check it out. Now, this is our only other news story this morning, A, for the sake of time, but B, because I thought it was such an appropriate introduction. Thanks for the heart there. Thanks for the love, Joe. I appreciate that. I recommend you check out that article because it was very inspiring to hear how this artist took what was basically a destruction of their decade of creation with heartfelt effort, all burnt, turned into something good. Now, we're not necessarily talking about that aspect of crisis today, but I think that it's important to know that crisis hits everyone. And what I mean is this generation, their crisis after crisis after crisis, if you look at it from young people's perspective, they've been experiencing what I call pandemic version 1 and pandemic version 2 and pandemic version 3, then known as the long COVID. They are experiencing something absolutely traumatic called this. I call it the stealing of smiles, as we've done with the masks. And then the rush, and right on the back of this, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All along, absolute what they are being told are there are no job prospects for you. There's not enough work for you. There's no future for you. On the back of that, then Russian invasion of Ukraine. And for these young people who have grown up in a relatively stable world, for a developed nation to invade another developed nation. Now, there is other crises. I'm not going to ignore that in the world. I was pointed out the other day that, hey, if you're ignoring Yemen, you're missing it too. There's things going on in Yemen. There's things going on in every corner of the world. But from the worldview of this generation, these crises are insurmountable and never ending. And it destroys, or at least shakes, their idea of a stable future. But is this new? You see, for my generation, as I was turning 18, 19, we watched the internet bubble collapse. The Yahoos of the world tanked. AOL was falling off. The internet bubble collapsed. And then, sure enough, 9/11 happened. And as we were getting sucked into the crisis thinking of 9/11, and as I even went to enlist in the military, it was suddenly clear to me that then the Patriot Act was coming in, and then the Iraq War right on its heels, and then Afghanistan. And by the time Afghanistan rolled around and subsequent events, I was inoculated to the fact that crisis will always come. And the powers that be want to suck you into crisis thinking. For the generation between this one and mine, they had Hurricane Katrina, the real estate crisis, the market collapse, and then, regrettably, the Boston Marathon bombings. These things are all tragic, and they are crises, and they're real, and real people are hurting. But you also have to note that every generation has milestones that cause that generation to have a little less security in their future. But at the same time, I believe this is the seed of opportunity to act on the same optimistic mechanisms that others have tapped into about their future. You see, what's worse than all this is it's getting more and more difficult for us to actually maintain a goal-oriented positive outlook. Once you go through enough historical crises, you start to wonder, should I set any goals? Should I be hopeful about anything? And the answer is yes. The answer is that if you have a good framework for crisis is inevitable. And that's actually one of the major points of a framework for crisis. So there's two parts to today. Number one, I want to give you a framework for dealing with crisis. And the net result is not necessarily a devil may care attitude or even ignoring what's going on. That's not the end goal. The goal is to give you a healthier mental framework for how to A, expect crisis, B, be able to work with crisis. But then the second thing is how I recommend you break out of and resist crisis thinking in general. Crisis will always happen. You don't always have to give in to crisis thinking. Now, if that's okay, let's talk about these real quick. And here's kind of the good news about all of this too, real quick side note. If crisis is always coming, and if every generation has had crises that have shaken their view of the future, and if you have seen other people break out of those crisis thinking and actually do something extraordinary with their life, you have to, A, give them even more credit. You know what? They didn't necessarily get there when it was easy. They got there in spite of this continuous crisis, and that means you have access to that too. Let's talk about it. Part one, a framework for crisis thinking. 4 quick points on this. Number one, you have to radically accept reality. A lot of people think, I just did a post yesterday that got a lot of conversation, and that was, I'm perfectly okay accepting a spike in gas prices if it's an economic stand against the oppression of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And you can imagine there was a lot of politicized response, both for and against. And for all of the logic aside from that, one of the critiques is you're not accepting reality about inflation. You're not accepting reality about blah, 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 blah. My worldview starts first and foremost. The spark worldview, first and foremost. It's happy-go-lucky. I get accused of being too overly optimistic, too positive, to be too hopeful in things, to not be accepting reality. You're not seeing reality for what it is. And this accusation is one of the accusations that chaps me absolutely the most because of this. I believe I have a better grasp, as we all do. We all have this paradigm. But I don't go through life seeing things and going, oh, I'm not going to deal with that. Something comes up, oh, let's ignore that. I look at the thing straight in the eye and accept it for what it is. Generally, most things that people want you to be panicked about are innocuous. Generally, they're just things, systems, trends, stuff that no one can really do anything about. I believe I have a radical acceptance of reality. And I believe I have a radical acceptance of the reality behind the reality, which is that very little matters, my friend. That's the real reality. That someone just pointed this out on my feed, and you got to hear this. Did you know Betty White's been dead for a month as of yesterday? I think, give or take. I might be off by a day or so. Betty White's been dead. Now, Betty White was a groundbreaker. Betty White had impacted acting. She was brassy. And if you go back to her earliest film, I mean, she has seen world wars come and go and impacted the film and television world. And you forgot about her. We forgot. So you and I, average people, we can only accept a reality that we will also die. And few people will remember us. And that's good. That means you should have freedom today to engage more with what you love, more with what you want to do. This is a radical acceptance of reality. So when people are handing you a Christ and say, now you may panic. If you have a radical acceptance of reality, step one, radical acceptance of reality, you're not going to panic. This is some wisdom from scriptures, man. And I believe every faith tradition has a version of this, but in Christianity, we've got Ecclesiastes. There is nothing new under the sun, my friends. There's only new context. But in principle, at its core, none of this is new. And if you can start there and have a radical acceptance, you're going to de-escalate your own. When someone tries to impose crisis thinking on you, you're going to de-escalate a little bit, number one. Number two, I alluded to it. Stay highly aware of your circle of influence versus your circle of concern. Now, this comes from, I can't reach it right now, the 7 Habits, it's right there in the bookshelf. 7 Habits of Highly Effective Thinking. 7 Habits of, Highly Effective People. 7 Habits of Highly, it's right here. One of the principles is the difference between circle of influence versus circle of concern. A lot of you are stressing about stuff you cannot influence. For those of you who are saying, oh, president, do something. So I watch a lot of crypto, and in cryptocurrency, when the price of a cryptocurrency tanks, there's this joke we tell each other. Rubes, complete noobs, people that do not understand cryptocurrency, they'll go on Twitter and they'll go, devs, do something. We want to create a shirt that says, devs, do something. And basically what they're asking is the developer of the cryptocurrency to do something to boost the price of that cryptocurrency. And devs always shoot back like, what do you want me to do? Cryptocurrency is out of their hands. It's a revealing of the lack of acceptance of reality, but also the acceptance of circle of influence versus circle of concern. When Stephen Covey pointed this out in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, as it comes to crises, and people are like, lower the price of gas, just go do it. Could you just go do that? Okay, armchair quarterbacks. How do you want me to do this? This is the best response. How would you like me to do that? And this was the response that Stephen Covey had from 7 Habits. How would you like me to do that? Would you like me to release all of our oil reserves? Would you like me to incentivize big oil to start drilling in national parks? And what should I do about the people that start throwing stones at me for allowing us to drill in national parks? How would you like me to do that? When you get panicked about a post on Facebook or anywhere, or a crisis that's handed to you, You need to differentiate your circle of influence versus circle of concern. And remember, we're talking about your peace of mind and your idea of a stable future so that you can get to the business of still creating abundance for yourself and for those around you. So if you spend any time in a circle of concern where you don't have influence, you're wasting energy and you're being susceptible to that crisis thinking. I think a great quote on this that I heard is, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Hear that again. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Now, time out. If you're watching and you're hearing something that you're like, that's awesome, there's somebody in your life that needs to hear that. Like, subscribe, or share, or tag them in this post, because I want people to have the tools they need, the mental tools and the heart tools they need to become abundant out of crisis, because that's my ultimate message today. We hit the first pandemic and Marissa and I tripled our investment because we could break from crisis thinking and actually move in a way that benefited us. And we saw a massive growth in some of our investments. And we're looking to position ourselves as this crisis with Russia and Ukraine kicks up and the market's looking like it's going to collapse. We're just positioning ourselves so that we can actually increase our circle of influence. Number one, have a radical acceptance of reality. Number two, identify the difference between your circle of concern versus your circle of influence. Number three. Oh, here we go. Boom. Dr. Joe Childs. The key is to remain in an emotional and spiritual state of resourcefulness. Now, you got to stop here. Like, if anything, this is the net summary of today's lesson. Accept reality, circle of influence. We're going to talk about grounding, how to ground yourself. And number four, solve a problem you can solve. This sums up all of that in a beautiful one-liner right here. Boom. Dr. Joe Childs. The key is to remain in an emotional and spiritual state of resourcefulness. Now, hear me. Emotional/spiritual. To me, that's emotional and spiritual. We cannot overlook the fact that there's an unknowable center to the human where there is a resourcefulness. And this is like abundance versus scarcity. And side note, the powers that be in the world don't want me to reveal this one secret to you, and that's this. They want you to give into crisis thinking because it's scarcity thinking. People want you to be in crisis thinking because you think of lack and limitation. Well, the gas is high. It is high. That's a radical acceptance of reality. But what are the implications to you? Well, I got to figure out how to make ends meet. Yes, that is also true. But maybe you need to leverage this moment to change your career. Or maybe you can become an activist. This is what it means to remain in an emotional and spiritual state of resourcefulness. Number one is a radical acceptance of reality. Number two is identifying the difference between the circle of influence versus the circle of concern. Number three, grounding. As soon as you recognize that you are being pulled into one of the polarities that the media and people want you to get sucked into. I'm pro-Ukraine. I'm anti-Ukraine. I'm worried about gas. I want gas prices to go up because I'm invested in oil. I'm worried about Putin. I'm worried about Biden. I'm worried about nuclear war. I'm worried about civil war. Whatever polarity you're getting pulled into, you need to let that be a trigger. You need to reprogram yourself. And sometimes there's the rubber band method. Sometimes it's a snap. Sometimes it's a tap yourself on the shoulder and realize I'm getting sucked into an extreme. Now I need to take a pause and ground myself. The third point is ground yourself. Much of these things are outside of your circle of influence. And as soon as you identify your circle of influence is different than your circle of concern, that should be an identification of, man, I'm getting sucked into the circle of concern that I've got no business worrying about. Ground myself. How do you ground yourself? Number one, meditate, hands down. Meditate, pray, journal, get quiet. Turn off all your media. Go outside and go for a walk. Number two, work out. Number three, touch or hug a loved one. Love the one you're with. Whoever you're with, shine and shower them with love and kindness. Show interest. Engage with them. Ground yourself in the moment. Take your shoes off and walk in the grass. Breathe and ask yourself, where am I? I am here. These are meditations. The point of grounding is to re-anchor yourself in the moment. Number one, radical acceptance of reality. Number two, identify the difference between circle of influence versus circle of concern. Number three, ground yourself. And number four, solve a problem you can solve. Budget. Sell a new client. If you can't sell a new client, schedule an appointment with a potential client. Follow up with that lead. Call your family to encourage them and see how they're doing. Take a shorter shower. Fix the toilet. I fixed the toilet this morning. If you're feeling lost, Marissa, a week ago, she was feeling a little down, a little lost, so she cleaned the whole house. Solve a problem you can solve. Make your life a little better. Go plant a flower and water it. This sounds so silly, but I am telling you, if you want a framework for how you deal and prepare for handling with crisis, having these mechanisms and these habits so that when crisis comes on, you pause. You have a radical acceptance of what's going on. You identify what you can influence and what you can't, which means you get to work on yourself and those that you can influence, which is grounding yourself, anchoring yourself in the moment. Don't try to escape it. Don't just turn on Netflix and binge. You can do that a little later, but pause and feel what you're feeling. Pause and take in what is going on. Grieve with those who are being hurt. Have empathy for those who are hurting others. Say a prayer, ground yourself, and then solve a problem you can't solve. Take action. Now, once you have this framework, and this is a repeatable process, every time crisis comes up, you have a repeatable process. Go play this back, share it with a friend. But then I want to give you a few quick pointers, just 3 quick pointers on breaking from crisis thinking. And I think this is important. And I cannot say this enough because there will always, and there always have been, there are, and there always will be people that want to influence your thinking. And you could call this the controlling elite. You could say it's the media. You could say it's the government. You could just say it's Putin. You could just say it's Biden. You could just say it's Elon. You could say it's me. Quite often, people want you to think a certain way. I want you to think a certain way. But what is my net desired result for you versus others? If you can distinguish crisis thinking, the thinking that leads to scarcity, the opposite of what Dr. Childs is talking about here, of a state of resourcefulness, if you can pivot that and see that they're trying to get me to think, to hoard toilet paper, they're trying to get me to constrict, to move from resourcefulness to restrictedness. This is the end goal, to not be susceptible to the way others want you to think. The goal is to clear your way for thinking so that you can think the way you want to think. Here's my 3 quick tips on this. And I'm going to unpack these, I think, a bit more later. I might even write a small, brief ebook on this because I think this is super important. Number 1, prepare for it before it happens. Now, remember, we gave you a framework for handling crisis thoughts and crisis thinking. How do you break the crisis thinking cycle? When they want you to move from pandemic 1, panic, lock yourself in the house, don't do anything, and shut your brain off. Go binge, go get DoorDash. Pandemic 2, maybe we can go out. Let's not go get a new job. Let's not go triple hustle. Let's not go start continuing the legacy building for our kids and our grandkids. You're just starting to get into zombie thinking. You're like, okay, I'm ready to dust this off. 2022 is a new year, new me, and now Russia and Ukraine. And gas is skyrocketing. I guess I'll stay home. I guess I'll cut off my social ties. I guess I'll turn my brain off. Every day that goes by is one less day you have to build for a legacy for your kids, your grandkids, to improve your neighborhood for those who don't have kids, to improve your city for those who are civic minded, to build that. I'll wait till the gas prices are lower to build my business. Listen, you got to break this thinking. The time is never perfect. The economy is never perfect. The time is very rarely right. There are those who get lucky with timing. And for them, timing seems like they got the timing right. But it is luck 9 times out of 10. It's very rarely ingenious strategy. More often than not, accessible to the rest of us is start before you're ready. Start before the time is right. And this is what I mean with this framework of breaking crisis thinking, because people will always want to drag you into that scarcity. We always want to drag you into resourcefulness. Number 1, prepare for it before it will happen. Living a life of hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. And my best example is this. There's a book out there called Emergency. This book might save your life. It was a very interesting investigative journalism about preppers in the early 2000s. It was fantastic. I was into prepping. I was petrified about the future. I was going to live as an absolute prepper. So this book, Emergency, this book may save your life. That's the title and subtitle of the book. A gentleman, an investigative journalist, went through Neil Strauss actually is his name. The author just came to me. He went through and spent about 2 years doing everything preppers recommend. Dual citizenship to another country, enough gold to bribe the border guard, capture your own water, how to kill and clean a goat from the ground up, how to make your own knife, how to do search of evasion, urban evasion and escape, where they would zip tie his hands and put him in a trunk and he had to escape. How can you actually survive? This book, Emergency, this book may save your life. Now, this was a very interesting book, and it was very empowering for other reasons in this 3-part framework. But what he said was this, the epilogue of the book, he said he was in his apartment that was leaking in the Turks and Caicos or wherever he ended up. He had his dual citizenship. He was in his house with his emergency generator that he had put aside because preppers say you need all the emergency generators, but his gas had run out. And he was out of gas because gas was expensive on the island. And this was the epilogue. He had lost his girlfriend in this process, and she was totally put off by the investigative journalism. Great book. He ends up walking down to the local pub, and he turns on the news. And there was the next market collapse on the news back in America. And he said this. He said, I don't know if I'll ever need to actually prep. I don't know if I'll ever actually need to bribe the border guard. But I tell you one thing. As I'm watching the next global crisis on TV, I'm not worried. And we'll talk about why in a quick second, but prepare before it will happen. That kind of leads me to the second point, which is minimalism. Marissa and I have been living a life of minimalism for many years. We're kind of not as minimal as we used to be, especially as we have more and more investments. But in terms of our personal consumption is so low, it's not even funny. Now, we have higher expenses with the business and with our properties and our investment, but have a strong savings. Lessen your needs, enjoy simpler pleasures. Like a lot of us are racing so that we can have a weekend of quiet and enjoy the quiet. Well, why don't you just cut out the first step and enjoy the quiet? Being mentally prepared, being prepared before it will happen. When you have that framework, it creates a resilience in your mind. I'm going to prepare before this happens. I'm going to have emergency savings for 3 to 6 months. Have you done that? Minimalism can empower the life necessary. Have a budget, have strong savings, have an emergency account, have a plan. Have a plan B, so if the shit does hit the fan, you know how to cook, you know how to clean, which leads to the third point. Self-reliance and self-sufficiency. They often say the biggest wealth is your earning capacity. And in a fiat economy, that's absolutely true. Your earning capacity is worth more than the money you have in the bank. But what is it in times of crisis? Skills. Can you camp? Can you hunt? Are you healthy? Are you fit? Now, not everyone has access to that, which goes back to the prepare. Be healthy. Start working on your health. And I know that there's a lot of exceptions where people are obese or they have a disease or illness. I get that. But most of us have access to being fit and healthy. Most of us can prepare our health, prepare our money, prepare our savings. And while you're doing that, acquire skills. Number 3, self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Do you know how to go out and sell? Do you know to go out and hunt? Do you know how to go out and garden? These create a mentality that makes you resilient when someone says, here's something you should panic about. When you know that, just like the author Neil Strauss can go back to the skills and go, I don't know what I'm going to do about this, but I'm not worried. That's what we hope for. Prepare before it will happen. Live a life of maybe a little more minimalism, not total minimalism, maybe a little more minimalism. Be self-reliant and self-sufficient. But here's my last bonus for all of you. When the world comes at you and hands you scarcity thinking, gas is too high, it's at an all-time high, and it is. We had the all-time worst, this, that, and the other president. Now, last president, whoever. When someone hands you, this is the next thing to panic about. You need to make more money. You need to be a better partner. Whatever the crisis is, this one thing is better than all the other tips I've given you. You ready? Have a pen. Write this down. I'm dead serious about this. I'm not kidding. This one thing is better than the framework for dealing with crisis and preventing crisis. This is my one bonus for you, and I'm going to leave you on this. Be kind and generous with someone near you. When someone hands you scarcity, I remember I was kidnapped in India many moons ago. Some of you have heard this story. I was kidnapped for a full day in India. And I absolutely freaked out. I was a little traumatized. I was traveling semester at sea and I didn't get off the boat for days. We were there for like 9, 10 days, maybe 14 days. I don't recall. Some of my fellow travelers are still around and we're still friends on Facebook. They can correct me. We were there anywhere from 9 to 14 days. I don't remember which. And like the first or second or third day, we went out and I was kidnapped for a day. And we got out of it. I won't go into that. But my reaction to it was to not go back out. I started to clam up. I started to close up. I started to have crisis thinking. I started to have a scarcity thinking. My safety was a scarcity. All they wanted was my money. They didn't want to get to know me. They just tried to rob me. And I started to clam up. And I didn't like how I felt at all. Have you had that? You go to the gas tank and you read all the negative posts and you want to start clamming up. Yes, you should save. Yes, you should live minimalist. Yes, we're going to have to tighten our belts. Forget even Ukraine and Russia and patriotism or not. Forget any of that. It's just a fact. We want to clam up. Have someone abused you? Has someone been verbally abusive, emotionally abusive? Is stuff tough at work? Has the pandemic made you a bit numb? That numbness is an emotional clamming up. It's emotional restrictedness. Your energies, you're starting to pull your energies back. This happened to me in India, and I hated how I felt. So what did I do? I went through all of my bags, all of my pockets, and I gathered up all the cash I had, all the rupees I had, all the money I had. And I walked through the streets and I gave my money away. I believe Dave Harvitz was there for that. Dave Harvitz is a contact and friend. You might see him in my Facebook. You can fact check him on this. I walked through the streets and I gave away as much money as I had and could. And by the time I finished, I was weeping. I had felt a dam break in my heart emotionally and spiritually, and I could access these people again. Not because I was giving them money, but because I wasn't closed off to them. Ultimately, someone giving you crisis thinking and trying to put crisis thinking on top of you is meant to weaken your social connections. It's meant to have you withdraw your energy and your resources from others. It's having you become less and less connected. And I mean spiritual, emotional, relational connected with people. Why? Economic freedom, first and foremost. Economic freedom, but also relational freedom, spiritual freedom, emotional freedom is in direct correlation with how connected you are with others, including spiritual others, God, divine intelligence, whatever you want to call it. The more you have the ability to connect, the richer your life is. And I said first and foremost economic. I should have said lastly, economic security is based on how tight your community is. When people give you crisis thinking, they are trying to weaken that. They may or may not know that. The powers that be, the controlling elite, our leaders, they might know that. Those giving around very negative Facebook, us or them, Facebook posts, us or them, us or them. These are people that are unintentionally trying to weaken your connection. It's trying to weaken your connection with them. The ultimate secret to opening your heart, to living richer, to creating a secure financial future, to having a secure relational future. Man, if the stuff really hits the fan, if stuff goes really bad for us, I'm going to go to my friend James' house because he's right on a river. He's right on a lake where we're going to go fish. And we're going to go meet our friend Jamie, who's got an awesome hunting rifle. He knows how to hunt. If I don't have those relationships, I don't have that economic security. But what is true in the natural is true in the spiritual. When someone is handing you crisis thinking, and you start to feel yourself clam up, go out and be kind and generous to someone who may or may not deserve it. Defy crisis thinking by being generous to someone who needs it. Defy crisis thinking by being kind to someone near you. Now, maybe walking away from there, you're going to say, hey, honey, we're going to have to tighten our belt. Hey, babe, we're going to have to save a little more and buy a little less coffee, eat out a little bit less this month. We know how to go grocery shopping. We've done that. We know how to go to Aldi. We know how to go to Publix and coupon shop. We've been there. We know how to do this. We can do that as long as it means that my connections deepen. Now, why would I want to prepare you for any of this? Why would I want to share crisis thinking with you? I think our minds and our spirit is being challenged, and it will continue to be. And that is not new. There's nothing new under the sun. I'm sharing this to you because I want you to remember we were made for a purpose. We were made for a mission. And the way I articulate that is igniting lives of explosive significance, starting with your own. Have a great